Okay, I'm going to start out with a little activity. I want you all to go like this. Can everybody do that? Now go the other way. Everybody got it figured out? It's a little hard to do that, isn't it? You know, we always mess this up. We're just trying to change your mindset a little bit about what you've been doing and how you do it and how you go about things on your farm. I'm going to tell you a little bit about myself. About 11 years ago, maybe 11 and a half years ago now, we planted our first cover crop. I've lived down by Bellevue, Minnesota, actually between Granite Falls and Redwood Falls. And I can tell you when I was out planting that first cover crop, I had 3 farmers stop by and tell me you can't plant anything in August, it'll never work. We'd just taken off some oats that we had chopped for silage, and had a neighbor convince me we need to plant covers out there and produce some more feed. We're wasting time. So I went out there and I said, well, this will never, I kind of agreed with my neighbors. I didn't think it would work either, but I had to prove them wrong. So I went out and we planted just oats and wheat in that cover crop, or in that field. And we proved those neighbors wrong, proved myself wrong. I had oats and wheat that was waist high, planted in August in Minnesota. And, you know, so we had a bunch of feed. So we proceeded to bring cows home, and we thought we were going to be able to graze cows for quite a while throughout that fall. And we did have a week of rain, and the cows laid all the feed flat. So we did have a failure. And you're going to see along the way, we do have a lot of failures. What I'm trying to do for you guys is trying to help prevent some of those failures. You know, after that winter, I talked to my neighbor, and he said, well, you did 2 things wrong. You should have planted turnips, or you should have planted some radishes with it, and then you should have strip grazed it so the cows couldn't have laid it all flat. And so you learn, you live and you learn, and you move on. And the next year we had a more diverse cover crop blend, and we added some brassicas, and we strip grazed it, and then we also saw some of the best soybean yields we'd ever seen following these cover crops. Now we actually follow a lot of these cover crop blends with corn, but that's what we were doing at the time. So I want you to look at your farm. What does your farm look like? Are you a conventional farmer? Are you a no-till farmer? Would you consider yourself to be sustainable, organic, or regenerative? I'm not saying there's one that's right or wrong. You might be several of these, you might be 1 or 2 of them, but what does your farm look like today? There's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture. You know, I always hear the sustainable word thrown around as you know, some of our good friends are saying, why would you want to sustain a degraded resource? We need to go back and regenerate these farms and regenerate these soils. But ultimately, regenerative agriculture is an approach to food and farming systems which aims to regenerate topsoil and increase biodiversity to improve the water cycle. So I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but that's to sum it up. So who's getting on with regenerative brands? I don't know if you guys saw in the news this week, but General Mills is doing whatever they can to get 1 million acres of cover crops and regenerative farming practices throughout the Corn Belt. But all these companies, including, you know, Land O'Lakes, Campbell's Soup, Tyson Foods, Pepsi, even Wrangler's jumping on board. McDonald's is on board with a regenerative brand as well. These are companies that are all actively engaged in trying to find a way to incorporate a regenerative label on their operations. So, anybody get any farm magazines? Have you read a farm magazine lately that doesn't talk about cover crops or soil health? You can't get anywhere. You can't see them anywhere. As a matter of fact, last winter I was sitting in a meeting with 8 very progressive farmers. And I brought this subject up, and he said, yeah, one of the guys said, I can't even look at a farm magazine anymore. I just started throwing them away because I was sick of seeing it, because I didn't think we could do it here. And I explained to him how he had several opportunities. He could have been planting a cover crop, and he could be doing it on his farm. I'll tell you, that was just an hour south of here. Now, on that note, I'm also going to say, we always say we can't do it here. I wish I was 2 hours further south. They say that in Iowa, too. So I know people north of here that are making it work, and I know a lot of you in the room are making it work. So we don't want to use that as an excuse. But when you look at this successful farming cover, you know, it's talking, you can see your new boss, and that's ultimately who does make our decisions. We need to make sure that we're going to provide what our customer is demanding. And you see it's talking about soil health, and now we're learning more about how there's a correlation between soil health and human health, and that's gonna, and we've been seeing the difference between soil health and animal health on our operation, on our cow-calf operation. So there's definitely some things that are going hand in hand. So what are some of the keys to soil health? These are the 5 principles of soil health. We want to keep the soil covered. We're going to reduce soil disturbance. We want to increase plant diversity. We want to keep a living root in the ground as long as possible and incorporate livestock whenever possible. Now that last one might be tough for a lot of folks, and we're going to touch on grazing livestock. That is the easy way to make this cash flow, but it's not the only way. Over the last 2 years, we've just been, I've actually been weighing the cows in and out, and we've been seeing an average after we wean calves, the cows have been gaining about 250 pounds in the fall while grazing that cover crop, and usually it's a 2 to 3 month period. So, but want to touch on each one of these. So keeping the soil covered, we need to do whatever we can to make sure we protect that. So would any one of you guys buy a brand new tractor and park it outside? Or do you want to put it in a shed? I don't think there's anybody that would do that anymore. Most of those guys are out of business. So we want to keep our soil covered too. Think of that as your most expensive asset. Reducing soil disturbance. We always hear that tillage is like a tornado. And we've got the soil biology, and we want them to build back up and reproduce and repopulate. So are you really going to be able to repopulate? Is your soil biology going to repopulate if it's got a tornado coming through its home 2 to 3 times a year? It's probably not going to happen, so you're going to be lucky to maintain the biological diversity that you have, and that's when you're going to have to continue to buy the bugs in the jug. So let's create a home and an environment and let it build on its own. Now you increase that soil biology, you're going to have to feed it, so that's where we need plant diversity. And I want to tell you right now, corn and beans is not a rotation. It's an alternation. We've got to get more diverse than corn and soybeans. Now, we could still have a corn and soybean rotation with other stuff in the middle. And I would rather just add a 3rd crop and we can get a lot more diverse. But even if you're just absolutely dead set against it, we can make some things work. We can plant rye into 34-degree soil. A lot of times we've got a lot of our crops off, maybe not this last year, but a lot of times we got our crops off while that soil is still above 34 degrees, so we can get a cover crop in there. But just remember, you've got a warm season grass and a warm season broadleaf. That's what we're doing. So if we can get anything else incorporated into the rotation, whether it's cool season grass, some cool season broadleafs, anything we want to try and incorporate that, whether we incorporate it through interseeding into a corn crop, and we're going to touch on a lot of this stuff as we go on and show you how to do that. And then keeping that living root in the ground. Right now, do you think there's a lot of living roots outside? If you went underneath the snow, especially if you went out in the timber, I'll just about guarantee you could find something green if you dug underneath all that snow. I've seen rye, for instance, green up every month out of the year, or throughout the winter. Not this year, but in several years we have. So we want to have the ability to capture that sunlight and capture produce photosynthesis and whenever possible to feed that soil biology. So what have we been doing? Has anybody seen ruts like that? How about anybody seen any dirt blowing around? I call the stuff that blows around dirt. I usually like to call it soil, but I think of soil as alive, a living organism. So this stuff is just dirt blowing around. How about that? Anybody got any drainage ditches around that look like that? I see these all over the Midwest, all over the Corn Belt. There we go. How about that? We do have water erosion too. A lot of times we get up here in the northern plains, we just think we've got a lot of wind erosion, but we do see a lot of water erosion too. We can see several gullies, and we've got to do whatever we can to stop that. This is actually in my neighbor's field back at home. This was a sugar beet field, and we tested that. We're going to see some of the tests on that. So, and then this is actually a piece of U.S. Fish and Wildlife ground on the right. and on the left is an edible soybean field, or edible bean field, kidney bean field. So, but we got to do whatever we can to stop that. We're seeing some massive erosion rates, and we can't continue to see that happen. They've actually tracked soil from Minnesota all the way over in Central Park in New York. So what can we do to hold that? So here's another shot. This is some stuff that we sampled. How would we like to have that soil? I always tell people, if your neighbors are going to let it happen, just make sure you capture it. Set yourself up so you can really build soil. If they're going to give it to you, it's free, right? So now just realize it's the best stuff that's leaving your farms. So do whatever you can, even if you just have to not till it. We want to get the covers in whenever we can, and we want to try and regenerate it, but just don't let it blow away. So soil degradation map. If you look on here, you'll see we're about we're right in the middle of the very degraded soils. So the first time I showed this map, I was asked, what are you basing this off of? And the easy way to base it is to go into a fence line. I know there's still a few fence lines around, and go into that area where that ground's probably about 4 feet higher than the rest of the field after it's been tilled for the last 100 years. That's going to be as close to what we want to use as a baseline as anything. You can go into some native pastures and things like that if you've got any around. I know there's not a lot around us, and probably not a lot here either, but this just shows you where it's at, and it also shows where it's going. So I found this, I actually stole this from Dr. Alan Williams on one of his presentations, but upon this handful of soil, our survival depends. Husband it, and it will grow our food, our fuel, and our shelter. It will surround us with beauty, abuse it, and the soil will collapse and die. So, future generations, I want to talk about that a little bit. Now, these are my 3 kids. This is Amelia, Coy, and Jace, and I want to make sure that they farm. So what can we do to make sure that your next generation's farming? Whether it's your kids or your grandkids, you want to make sure you give them an opportunity. So the good thing is we can help. We can do a lot of good stuff, and we've been working on this for several years. There's been farms out throughout the Midwest that have been doing this for 25 to 30 years, and we've all got grandpas and great-grandpas that used to do it several years before that. Unfortunately, there was a big gap where we didn't care about it, and now it's starting to come back, and now there's a lot more operations that are just getting into it over the last 5 years, and we're getting to see a lot more data. So I just want to show you these different fields. This is a soybean field, and these 2 are corn fields that we were both interseeded in. You can see there's a little more diversity in that. This is just a mixed annual ryegrass. That soybean field was actually oats and radishes and turnips that they built. These farmers built a kind of a high boy system to go out and seed cover crops into their beans right as they were starting to turn yellow. So we can have some good success. So where are we today in trying to decide to use cover crops, and what are some of the biggest things holding us back? I can tell you values and social support is huge. Nobody wants to be that person that walks into the coffee shop and it gets quiet. And we always told people for years to stay out of the coffee shop. Just don't worry about it. Just do what you got to do. And we also used to tell people to start small and do it on the back 40. Now that we know that things are working, we're telling you to do it right on the front highway and go to the coffee shop and tell everybody what you're doing. We can't continue to hide. We have to explain to everybody. We were having a conversation this morning. We need to educate the landowners. We need to make sure the landowners understand what's going on and understand the value of cover crops and no-till and soil health principles. So as we get more access to information and we're starting to generate a return on our investment, we're seeing more people jump on board with this. So, this is probably where we were up until a couple years ago. And if you've been involved in this industry at all, you understand it's absolute chaos right now. Last week alone, I was at 5 soil health meetings. And that's not to mention farms that wanted to have their own meetings set up, and you go in, and we've been helping farms develop plans and how can we incorporate cover crops into this acre or that acre or this field or that field. But it's like the Wild West out there. So things are really taking off, and I always, that snowball is getting bigger, and we're going to continue to see this growing. And like I say, that's where we're at right now. Just in a couple years, we're going to see the early majority jump on board, and I really believe within the next 10 to 15 years, we're going to see a very large percentage of this ground cover cropped, and you guys want to be the first ones on to do it. So some of the main cover crop benefits. So managing soil moisture, I think this is probably one of the biggest advantages to soil health. And I hear I can't do this because I'm out in dry land out in western South Dakota, and you know what? He's right. He can't do the same thing that we can do in central Minnesota. Your land, every field is different. We've got certain fields we can't do the same thing on, much less we can't do always the same thing in the same state. But one thing we can always do is manage soil moisture with cover crops. So when we get into a really wet, heavy soil situation where they always say you can't do cover crops here because it's too wet, we need to have an overwintering cover crop that's going to help suck up some extra moisture. How about water infiltration and improving soil tilth? I always hear we run the planter through that cover crop blend and couldn't believe how much easier the planter pulled. The water infiltration, we had one producer in Renville County that had a 23 bushel yield advantage on planting soybeans into rye after sugar beets over any of his other fields. That's over several hundred acres. Now, he also made the comment this was the only field he didn't have water damage in. Now, I'm not saying it's not a true side-by-side comparison. There could have been a lot of different variables. But the fact that we know we infiltrated a higher percentage of the water where the rainfall landed. So just think of this. You've got your hilltops and you've got your drowned out spots, and almost every field has some of them, right? Except until we get over in the Red River Valley, then it's all just perfectly flat. But when we got these fields, we want every raindrop to infiltrate where it lands. So if we can infiltrate that rain, it'll go in and infiltrate there, preventing less water to infiltrate or to run off above ground and all accumulate at your drowned out spots. So that'll grow bigger crops on our hilltops, and it'll reduce the size of your drowned out spots in your low ground. So you're going to have a huge benefit from that water infiltration. I always hear at home, anybody can grow 200 bushel corn if you got enough rain. Well, let's just make sure we manage the moisture that we get. Preventing leaching of nutrients, and then in turn reducing fertilizer costs. If we're capturing those nutrients, and I'm talking a lot more than just nitrogen, but if we're managing and holding those nutrients in place, do you think we ought to give it a credit? You think it's going anywhere, or should we just forget about it? Once we start getting more nutrient cycling going on through more diversity, we're going to start to capture some of these unavailable nutrients that are unavailable to the corn and soybeans that we've been planting. Now we start cycling some of those nutrients, and we can definitely start cutting back on some fertilizer costs. Reducing compaction, that is probably one of the easiest things to do. It doesn't happen year one, but if we continue to plant some diverse covers and grow roots in these soils while we're in the off season, typically late fall, we get some wet times in there. It's really easy for roots to go down and do our tillage for us. Same with early spring. When we get into early spring, it's really easy to loosen that soil up, and we don't have to just use radishes. Actually, grasses sometimes break up compaction as well as anything. So we want to remember that. Increasing organic matter. We used to hear some crazy numbers. It takes 100 years to build a point of organic matter. Well, we see people doing it a lot faster than that, especially if you're willing to let some cover crops grow, especially if you're going to we'll just use rye for instance. If we're going to let rye grow throughout the month of May, we can really build that carbon up, and we can help to build organic matter. If you really want to do it fast, take it out of corn and beans in general, plant a full season grazing cover crop and incorporate cows and manage that grazing. You can increase organic matter very fast, and just think of that as building your bank account. Breaking weed life cycle, we're going to touch on that a little bit, reducing some diseases and nematodes. I can tell you if you got a white mold issue, the best way to do it is to plant beans in rye. I'll show you some examples where we've increased yields and we can definitely reduce erosion. But ultimately, if we do all that, we're definitely going to be increasing profits. So here's just a picture. This is in eastern South Dakota, same hybrid, same planting date. Planted into a cover crop, planted into conventional tilled. This was actually taken a couple years ago. So there's a huge advantage. And especially when we get into some of these drier lands, I've often heard, well, I irrigate, I don't need to worry about water, about that. Well, what if we could irrigate less, you know? And I don't know what percentage of you guys deal with irrigation, but I know it's expensive. So if we get a little less water out there and still grow a crop like that, obviously that one's going to have a higher yield potential. So when we talk about infiltration, how does it look? How does water infiltration look? So I'm going to use this example being a tilled situation where we went out there maybe with the disc ripper in the fall and then came back with a field cultivator in the spring, and we got that perfect seed bed that everybody talks about, and then we get one hard rain and it compacts. So I heard on a egg show the other day, radio show the other day, how tillage helps increase water infiltration. Well, that'd be true the first time it rains, but after that it's not true anymore. So we can definitely get better water infiltration by allowing the no-till here to improve our soil structure, and we're going to have more soil or better soil aggregates, and that in turn is going to let that water infiltrate through the soil particles. And this is really what we're trying to emulate. Now this is a perennial system, but you see how the roots are down. We want to have diversity in our roots and different root structures, so that's going to help for that water to infiltrate through there. And I'll ask the question, if you got a field and you get to the end of the field and it starts raining, and you got two options. You can either drive back through the field, or you can open up the pasture gate and drive back through the pasture. Which one are you going to do? You're always going to take the pasture every single time. So why is that? Because you got better soil aggregation, you've got better water infiltration, and you're going to be able to float and get back through there without worrying about getting stuck and making a mess. You go back in your tilled fields, you're always going to have that issue and that possibility of getting stuck. So what do these soil aggregates actually look like in real life? So a few years ago we did some plots here. When I say plots, I like to do full field plots. I don't like the little 10-foot strips or anything like that. But we went through and this was actually after a sugar beet crop. We went in and seeded winter rye and radishes, and this is the following spring. And you just look, that was just kind of clumpy as I picked it up, and it just kind of broke apart, and you could tell there was no soil aggregates there. It was kind of the black powder. Over on this side, definitely a little more moist, but you can kind of tell that black cottage cheese look. And that's when you know things are starting to work. We actually followed the soil temps through these two fields, and we were actually right on the money with those two. Across the road, we had just a no-till cornstalk field. We were about 3 degrees cooler in that, which makes sense, but we talk about soil temperatures. Have something green will help just about as much as having something black. You're not going to be off more than a day. So here's another one, what it can look like, and look at that root mass there. I will tell you, when you deal with some of these overwintering cover crops, which a lot of times we're going to need to do because we're not going to get into a little bit later, you do not want to till them up. Roots like that dug up is going to make a mess. So definitely just plant right into it. It's very, very easy. It's scary the first time, but it's really easy to do. You'll always wish you did more. So nutrient cycling. This is just a chart I found kind of showing what's going on with all the stuff. And if you don't have that cow, I want you to remember this one thing. There's roughly 2,000 pounds of living bacteria in every acre of soil, of healthy soil. So that would be the equivalent to roughly 2 cows. And just remember, the more you feed them cows, the more they're going to produce for you. So you can start cutting back on some nutrients as you get your soil healthy and functioning. Now you can't do it right away. You definitely can't cut back on nitrogen right away, but you can start, especially with some of the others. So soil testing. Remember the top meter of soil contains thousands of tons of minerals. But how deep does our soil test go? Specific microbial function groups have access to this mineral fraction, provided the release of liquid carbon, which is produced from plants. So liquid carbon is going to be basically that root exudate that those plants release. And if you've ever pulled up a plant and you found that kind of jelly looking, that's your carbon that's going back into and the root exudates that's going back into the soil, which in turn is going to help build you organic matter. But your high potassium and phosphorus fertilizers will inhibit the formation of the plant microbe bridge called mycorrhiza fungi. So classic models are regular soil tests, and these classic models for soil carbon dynamics are based on conventional managed fields. So that's why we'll use the Haney test, for example. You hear, especially in Minnesota, we always hear, well, that's Haney test, it doesn't work. It's not quite figured out for our soils. Well, I would say it's definitely not working in a soil that's not being managed in a biological way. But if your soil is being managed in a biological way, now you can start to utilize that Haney test. Now, if there's some keys to using that test properly, you really want to do it in the spring when your soil is 58 to 60 degrees to have the most accurate rates. So some soil facts. We've got 30,000 tons of nitrogen per acre in the atmosphere above every acre. So maybe our goal, rather than buying nitrogen, should be how can we pull that nitrogen out of the atmosphere and put it back into the soil? Soil showing greater than 15 parts per million of phosphorus is going to inhibit your mycorrhizae to function. This is going to limit nutrient cycling. So we want to do both, and maybe that's where interseeding comes in, and we plant these legumes and with the grasses, and we work things together. So now we can use the mycorrhizae to transfer nutrients back and forth, and the legumes are going to help produce some nitrogen and feed the corn, and in turn they're going to return the favor, and they're going to give some nutrients back. The corn's going to give some nutrients back to the legume to work. So remember, plants use carbon number 1 and nitrogen number 2. All we ever talk about is nitrogen. But if you've been to any of these soil health summits, the carbon's probably the number 1 talk, and for a very good reason. It is the number 1 feeder, especially for corn. So corn and soybean alternation is less than 50% of collecting solar energy. What does that mean? It means we are capturing less than 50% of the sunlight to create photosynthesis to feed our soil. Liquid carbon is the root exudate, which is 5 times more likely to end up as organic matter than your crop residues that you're currently digging into your field. Don't worry about that crop residue. We want to keep the crop residue. We surely don't want to take it anywhere. We don't want to let anybody come in and rob it from us. We don't want to let it blow away, but we absolutely want to grow as much of that root exudate as we can, and that's going to have to be through our cover crops. 1% organic matter can hold up to 25,000 gallons of water per acre, which is roughly an inch. What would that do to some of the flooding that we see throughout the country if we could increase every acre on just 1% of organic matter? So nutrient calibration. How many of you, let's see a raise of hands, how many of you go out and check your cornfields in late summer and try to guesstimate what your yield is? You pull the ears back and you count down and around and you figure out your population. Everybody's figured that out. So I'm still not sure how accurate we ever are, but we've all figured that out. So anyways, now we can take a radish, and we're working on some others, other cover crops, but the radishes were kind of the first ones where we started to do this research, and we could figure out what was going to be available for nutrients. So this chart's a little bit, a couple years old, but anyways, let's just say we got 6-inch radishes, which say after a small grain is very doable. If we get 4 per square foot, you just follow that over, and we had a $64 value, and that might only cost us $10 to $15 for seed. So these nutrients are going to be available. So we did a case study on this. We wanted to follow through and figure out what could we actually do for yield. And so in this situation, they did 60 pounds of nitrogen that they had applied pre-plant. Then there was never any additional N added. Around August 1st, this was in a prevent plant situation down in Iowa where we did this test. But around August 1st, the field was disked, radish seed was broadcast, and they used a roller to ensure the seed contact, and that's what we got. That stand right there is what it looked like in the fall. So the next that fall, we went out to see what we had for nutrient uptake. And we sampled all that. We sampled the above and below ground nutrients and what was taken up in the plant. And we saw 364 pounds. Now remember, we'd only put 60 down. So where did the rest of it go? Remember, we're only soil sampling the top 6 inches of soil, right? We got this 364 pounds of nitrogen. You can see what we got for nutrient uptake, which is an excellent yield. So what we did following that next year is we went and did strips where we planted corn into that. And we went 0 added and 50 pounds, 100, 150, 200. And this is the yields that we got. You can see with 0 added in, we had 183 bushel corn, which, hey, that'd be pretty good in a lot of situations, but not for Iowa. So with 50 pounds, we got 237. But our question was, and you can see through on the rest of the way, it definitely didn't pay, but it did pay to add a little bit. But why in the world did we need any? We just found out we had 364 pounds. Well, first off, not all those nutrients maybe were available, but I think more than anything, what was the problem? It was a straight stand of radishes. I would never recommend to do a straight stand of any brassicas, especially radishes. Your carbon to nitrogen ratio is going to be way too low, and those nutrients are going to become available way too fast. And that's exactly what happened in this situation. If we'd have added oats or something with a higher carbon content, we could have slowed down the breakdown of that, the nutrient breakdown process, and we could have had those nutrients available throughout that next growing year. So really, when we're developing a cover crop blend, this should almost be one of the first things we look at is we got to identify our goals and to figure out which cover crop we're going to plant. We need to identify what our resource concerns are. How high or low is your biological activity? You talk to guys that have been doing this for several years, their biological activity is just, it's really high. They've got a lot of stuff going. Their system's humming, so they'll always tell you they need to produce more carbon. So they'll get into higher grass, higher carbon cover crops, and they want to, otherwise they'll see that their crop residue is breaking down too fast, and then they don't have the soil covered. Right back to the basic soil principle of keeping that soil covered. So that's going to change. If you're early on, you're going to probably be a little more on the brassica and legume side. If you're later on in the system, you're going to do more of the grasses and higher carbon crops. I like to have several of all three of those, but it does depend on the situation, and it's going to depend on the ratios of what's in that mix. You also got to look at what your next cash crop is. A cover crop is not just a cover crop. We can talk about some yield data that showed there was a huge yield drag in corn after a cover crop. Well, it was probably after rye that was planted into, it was probably corn planted into rye that was shoulder high in Iowa, and they never fed it any more nitrogen. Well, we all know that the nitrogen's all tied up, so that's why that didn't work. So you got to set up the right cover crop ahead of the right cash crop, and you do that by figuring out what that carbon nitrogen ratio is going to be to increase that yield. Where we really like to go is plant corn into a cover crop with a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio following, say, a small grain that was grazed, and we can really stimulate some corn growth in that situation. Remember, if you are planting corn into an overwintering cover, you don't want to let that cover crop get too tall, and you will have a lot of nitrogen tie up. But that'll change as things go on, and the best way to speed that up is to add a legume to that situation. So where can we plant cover crops? And I just got a list here, and I'm sure I'm missing some for this area. But after sugar beets has been where we really started at around home, then got into edible beans and silage, following a small grain, corn interseeding. But we've been working on that for about 10 years now. Or after black layer. If we can't get in, last year we had some issues getting in because it was too wet. So we went in after black layer and seeded some covers there. Or in a lot of cases, we're just drilling rye after we take off the corn crop. And I know there's people north of here doing that as well. And then after sweet corn, peas, or aerial into beans. But notice I'm pretty sure I got most of the situations. I've checked most of the boxes. We can find a way. Your biggest limit is your imagination. There's a way to get a cover crop seeded into just about every situation. So what are our planters going to look like? or, you know, this is actually one of the non-biological units. We're starting to see more and more roller crimpers, but I think this is the future of what we're going to see in the area. And I can tell you, we can protect that soil very well, and we can help prevent a lot of diseases with just having a cover just like this one right here. So that kind of wants to be the goal. So we got some options. We can continue to do this, and we've all seen that throughout the entire Midwest. But keep running a ripper, and we can keep getting stuck, or we can run an air seeder or a drill or anything like that and get out there and seed some cover crops. So, how many, do you guys have white mold? Anybody have white mold up here? Yeah? So this is, I heard it said there's no silver bullet in agriculture, but planting soybeans into rye is a silver bullet, and it'll help with white mold. If you know anything about white mold, you know it's a spore that's in the soil. And what we do when we can plant into rye like this, and even if you can't plant into rye like this, you can always plant your beans into rye and let the rye grow with the beans for a while and then terminate the rye later. You can roll or crimp it. You can use a herbicide. I've got several that they're planting beans into rye, and then we're going to let it, we'll let it grow for 2 to 3 weeks. We'll let that soybean get the second leaf. Last year we had 2 guys go out with just a smooth drum roller, roll that rye down at second leaf on the soybeans, and actually that was the only pass they had to make. They didn't even make another herbicide pass. So I will not guarantee that. Don't come back to me if it doesn't work, but we were in that situation, we had herbicide as an option. So it worked really well, and knowing that we had that as a backup plan, we didn't have any issues. But you think of that rye laying over flat, now you're locking that white mold and some of those other funguses in the soil. And when we can lock that down there, now the rain comes down, rather than splashing off the soil and bouncing back and hitting the lesions on the soybeans, now we've got clean water bouncing back, hitting the soybean, and we don't have the white mold issue. Does that make sense? So that is one of the biggest reasons. Another reason why we're seeing some yield advantages to this is you got a nitrogen tie-up. Soybeans like that competition early. They keeps the nitrogen from them. They do a good job of doing what they're supposed to do as a legume. And then they do like some nitrogen late season around pod fill time, and about that time is when your rye's starting to break down. So we did some cost comparisons, and this is what I see a lot of times. We'll see it's amazing what some of these producers are doing, but we're running some vertical tillage 201s and sometimes even twice, and we'll see a disc ripper out there in the fall, and then spring cultivating. I didn't add the rolling cost because we might see that in both. I didn't add the crust buster that we might need in the first comparison after we get a heavy rain and we can't get that soil to break through, and we need, or the beans to break through the crusted soil. So anyways, left out a few things here, but this is a pretty good comparison. We're going to save anywhere from $14 to $25 an acre, and we've seen a consistent 3 to 6 bushel yield increase in this situation. So it might make beans work now. You know, I know beans are kind of tough, but we are, if we can do some things like this, it's going to give us a benefit down the road. So this is what it might look like. And notice there's not quite as much rye there in the middle where the corn is versus where the beans are, but this does really help. Now look, you can still get some weeds, but it doesn't happen. It really depends on how thick you seeded that rye cover. So here's another planting green. This was just soybeans here. Here they're actually planting corn into that. This is what it looked like later on. This was strip tilled. This was fall seeded rye. This was after sugar beets, and then went through and spring stripped it. And I actually took that corn looked awfully yellow to me, so I was really nervous about that. So I took a couple of the corn plants up, and we took them across the road into a conventional system, and they were every bit as green as the neighbors. So, and you can see it worked out pretty well as the corn grew up. So just some keys to planting corn green: put a starter in furrow, get proper seed placement. You really want seed, that seed placement's crucial in every situation, but definitely if we're going to plant corn into this. Early on, you might need aggressive trash cleaners. I know as you get down the road, a lot of guys are saying take it off, but I'll tell you, in the first part of your transition, it's better to be ready for it. Get out of the tractor early and often to check for seed depth, and doing earlier termination of covers, typically either at 10 days ahead of time or 5 days after, seems to work really well. So just increasing yields. Mentioned this earlier, but following a sugar beet harvest where we had 73 bushel soybeans, that was 23 bushel better than the conventional tillage on the several hundred acres. And we're seeing this increased water infiltration. Earlier maturing beans makes harvest earlier. We're seeing the pods set up higher. We're not seeing any white mold, and we're seeing a lot cleaner fields. We're seeing a lot less of the glyphosate resistant weeds, and we're just having greater profits in these situations. So here's a picture. We'd sent up a drone. I want to take a picture of this. This is a field not planted the same day, but it is the same hybrid, and it's planted kind of like that first picture early on. This was planted into a cover crop. It was a winter-killed cover crop. This was planted into conventional tilled, and this was not last summer, but 2 summers ago. We kind of got into a dry spell between June and July, and this corn over here was starting to really curl up, and I was really excited to get some yield data back on this. And then we proceeded to get 10 inches of rain in August, and everything kind of came back. So we didn't get a great difference in yield, but just to show what this corn can do when you give it an opportunity to soak up that moisture. So some of the cover crop myths we got to debunk, and no-till myths. My soil will never warm up. Keep it green, it'll warm up. It'll never dry out. There again, if it's not going to dry out, keep it green. Rye uses an inch of rain a day if you're going to use that. Cover crops lead to increased herbicide use, or none at all maybe. It all depends on what the situation is. You're going to have that one pass where you're definitely going to have to terminate a cover crop, but you can also, a lot of times, that might be the only pass. And cover crops don't work here. Tell that to your neighbor, because everybody's got a neighbor within 20 miles that's planting cover crops. We can take you just about anywhere and find somebody that's making it work. So the argument, we tried no-till here 20 years ago and it didn't work. Well, we didn't understand, we didn't have the equipment that we have today. We didn't have Delta or any of the other tools that we've got. We didn't have the technology, and we didn't understand how cover crops fit into this system. I will tell you that cover crops make no-till work a lot easier. They really help in that transition phase. We hear that there's a 3 to 4 year yield drag when we transition to no-till. Cover crops can help reduce that, and a lot of times we don't need a yield drag at all. Little situation here. We had an early harvested field. There was 55 acres, planted August 15th, the oats, radishes, and turnips and rape. They grazed 45 cows for 65 days, left a good cover to protect the soil. That seed cost was $15 an acre. So that next spring they harvested 76 bushel soybeans, breaking the farm record by 6.3 bushels. That's not including all the grazing that they got off of that. There was probably about $70 to $80 worth of grazing per acre on that as well. So find an opportunity. Take anywhere you can. Anything you get early harvested, somewhere that you can graze if you've got livestock. Look at something you can interseed. Anything that you're going to farm. It doesn't matter what the situation is. So how about early interseeding into corn? We could go, we've been going at V3 to V7. I'd actually rather be at V2 to V5 anymore, but that kind of gives us a safe number. We need to be species specific and watch our herbicide carryover, but remember, the earlier the better. Last year I had several people going at germination or as soon as the corn was starting to spike up, and as long as we could time it with the right herbicide, we had really good success rates. This is some of the success that we have. This is really fun getting in these situations so we can go see these whole fields that are green as soon as we combine. This will really get the neighbors talking if you want to get them talking. So how are we getting this done? We can do all kinds of things. We see a lot of side dress applicators getting set up with either a Gandy or Valimar box. We see some drills getting retrofitted. We've seen, this is a homemade deal with the Valimar box, and they took an old Livestock cultivator and set it up. I can tell you he's now taking those wheels off just because he doesn't feel he needs to, as we're going in early enough now. He's had success at getting it established. This is one just taking an old Rotary hoe, and this has worked really well. Here's an example of what that one did. So there's lots of ways to get that incorporated. But now I want to talk to you guys about your corn soybean rotation, and if you really don't want to add a third crop, how are you going to get that diversity? This is really showing some pretty good promising signs of being applicable in a lot of situations. I can tell you, I don't think I would waste my time with the 30-60, 30-60 like we have here, but we have several producers going to straight 60-inch corn. That gives us a lot of opportunity. I can tell you they studied the 60-inch corn to increase yields. It's not going to probably increase yields, but we can maintain yields. We're maintaining our corn populations. There is some hybrids that work better than others. You probably want to go with the semi to moderate flex hybrid. And how the cover crop world got into it and kind of how I started looking at it was I had a lot of people that wanted to incorporate covers, so they were going out and getting their diversity early by seeding that cover crop into that corn at V4 to V7 or V3, somewhere in that area. And then, but they also wanted to plant beans into rye. Well, we can't get winter rye to work underneath this corn canopy all the time. So we'd have to come back and seed rye again later. So now we're planting corn, planting our cover crop, and then come back and plant another cover crop, and then we'd come back and plant beans after that. Well, that's when I saw this, and I thought maybe this will work better. Maybe we can get the rye to work and grow. So now we can plant our corn, plant our cover crop. After you harvest, you're ready for next year. And we're in, my studies are still in year 1. I can tell you one of the keys to this is nutrient placement. If you can apply your nutrients in row, this could really be a game changer. We're seeing anywhere, roughly 3,000 pounds of biomass from our cover crop produced in between the rows versus our early interseedings, about 350 pounds. So a little bit more about Soil RX. We are a cover crop and soil health consulting company. We work all over the upper Midwest, and we are in several states. We're also doing some land management where we are focused on working with absentee landowners and connecting them with farmers who are doing regenerative ag practices, and at all levels, whether you're no-till, cover crops, and everything in between. If you're focused on improving the land, we're happy to work with you. We also do custom cover crop recs, and we can help you build blends for your situation, for each field. You can learn more about us at soilrx.net. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And we've also got a YouTube channel called Cover Crop Kings. So with that, I appreciate it. And if you got any questions, I'll be around here the rest of the day.